Gouache. Whoosh, whoosh. If you hang around the art community or an art store long enough, you're bound to hear this word, with very few people actually knowing what it is. But that's okay, because I'm going to tell you exactly what gouache is and how to use it. Hi there, welcome to Let's Create Something. Today we're going to be talking about gouache. It's gouache, that's how you say it. Now, a lot of people like to think it's like a watercolor, and some people call it an opaque watercolor, which it kind of is, but the best way I can describe it is like, imagine if acrylic and watercolor had a baby, that would be gouache. It's not quite a watercolor, however, it can behave like a watercolor, but it's way more opaque because watercolor is very translucent. Gouache is opaque. But it can also, function like a acrylic or a regular, paint where you have layers and you paint dark to light. It can follow both rules. You can paint it light to dark, or you can go dark to light. So it's kind of like a watercolor without actually being a watercolor, but it's also kind of like an acrylic without actually being an acrylic. So it's just chaos pretty much. So when you're trying to understand it, it depends on how you want to approach it. Because like this is also gouache, this is a gouache painting, but also this is a gouache painting. But you can clearly see how this one looks a lot more like watercolor, and this one looks a lot more like just regular, oil or acrylic painting. And that's because the artist who did this used more of a watercolor style, and then on this one he used more of a regular traditional painting style. So I'm going to approach this tutorial on, I'm going to show you how it can be used kind of like watercolor, and then I'm going to show you how it can kind of be used like regular traditional paints. Now for gouache, you're going to need the same thing pretty much used as watercolor. You're going to need 2 cups of water, 1 for dirty water, 1 for clean water added to pigment. You're of course going to need some type of palette. I like to use a white plate because I can see the colors better. You're going to need napkin, of course, and brushes. I just use the same brushes I use for watercolor, which are synthetic. And of course you're going to need watercolor paper because you're going to use a lot of water, or you can paint on canvas. You can also do that with these. I'm going to use watercolor paper. And then of course you're going to need gouache paints. Now I just went out and bought the cheapest paints, which are these right here. Dreams, which is the cheapest paint you could probably find out there, gouache style. Now if you buy expensive paint, again, just like every other more expensive art item, the paint will spread farther and it'll blend better, but I mean, this is good enough for beginners. So here we go. Now I've taken burnt sienna in both gouache and watercolor and kind of done like a variation here. And you can see how the watercolor side is very, very transparent versus the gouache side, which is very opaque. It's almost got like a chalky, velvety type texture to it. So you can see how as we go up on the gouache scale, you can do it light, just like watercolor. I mean, it's not as translucent, but you can also do it thick and do, like paint layers, just like you do acrylic or so. So again, it can be used both ways. It doesn't really have, like this is the way it's supposed to be done. It's like, no, it's just, do you want to do it more watercolor? Do you want to do it more like traditional paint? So I'm gonna go ahead and do watercolor first, and this is how I get started. So like watercolor, you just need a tiny bit of pigment because it's water soluble, so I just put a little bit and just add a bit of water to it just to kind of get it, flowing. Not too much, because if you use too much, it could be way too watery and the pigment won't really actually carry. So you just use a little bit of water, and I'm going to paint the background. Now with this, I'm doing the watercolor technique, so you usually paint light to dark. So I'm going to do the background first. I'm going to put like a nice wash, and I think I'm just going to do trees or something. I don't really know. So I'm just going to put this light wash in the back, and then I'm going to come back with a slightly more pigment, a little bit less water, and I'm going to start putting, trees on there, and I'm going to start building these masses. And so what I'm trying to do, the effect is like, far away, it's more faded. As it gets closer to the person in this picture, the trees are more darker. So I'm just going to, add a little more pigment. And gouache is very good for adding line work. So at the very end, I'm going to just add these little line, just really give it accents, really pull out, whatever's in there. So like you can see here, I mean, it looks like a watercolor. Like if you were to look at this, most people would think this is a watercolor. And like I said, it's doing this because I'm using a lot more water than I need to. And I'm also doing, watercolor techniques, painting light to dark. However, you don't have to do that. Like I said, you can use it like traditional paints. So I'm going to show you how to do it with this. I made a little fish drawing. I'm going to show you how, I would just do it traditionally. And again, it's just like anything else, acrylic or oil, you start dark, you go dark to light, and you start with your background and come forward. So I'm going to start with the background. I'm not really caring too much, so I'm actually doing a little bit of a lighter. This is kind of like the watercolor technique, but whatever, I can always change it later. So I'm just gonna, block out the color in the background, and maybe I'll go ahead and, use what we learned before and add a little bit of seaweed here and there, so it just looks a little bit interesting. And I'm just gonna go and I'm gonna start blocking out colors, which I would do regularly for like acrylic or oil. I'm going to block out the face with yellow, and as you can see, I'll just do it right here now. I can add colors on top of this. It doesn't mix. It's not like watercolor. It dries really, really quickly. In fact, it dries almost instantaneously. So, I can go ahead and put this on top of another layer to lighten it up, you know, add some white, maybe add some more, you know, different colored yellow, a little bit brighter. And so I can just build on top of it. And that's what you're gonna do. Like I said, it's pretty much just like acrylic or oil, where you just build layers. You go dark to light. So I'm just gonna go ahead and block out the rest of this like so. I'm gonna add little bits of color. I'm going pretty fast. And then I'm just gonna, you know, do a little bit of line work, add some color here and there. I'm just gonna try to, you know, fill out the space really quickly. But as you can see where I'm going, I'm painting in layers. It's just like acrylic, it's just like oil, completely different from what I was doing before. I'm adding a lot more thicker paint. I'm adding just a tiny bit of water just to like kind of, you know, get the paint going, but I'm not, you know, I'm not putting a whole bunch of water like watercolor or staining or anything like that. I'm just using it like regular paint. I'm just adding, you know, color on top of another color. I'm lightening it up. I'm gonna add some outlines on it. And there you go. Now, I didn't spend too much time on it, but I also did a painting earlier with this in watercolor. And you can see the clear difference. Again, I spent way more time on the watercolor than I did on this one, but you can just see how opaque and how strong the colors are in the gouache one versus the watercolor one. I know it's not the greatest tutorial, but it's because it really is, you know, a weird medium, because it can be treated like a watercolor, but not completely, because you'll notice the color doesn't go, you know, it doesn't bleed out as far as watercolor is. It's also not as translucent, but you can also treat it like an acrylic, where you can just put layers on top of each other, but not as much, because it does have the element where if you add too much water, it does start to bleed a little bit, so you start to lose that thickness. So again, I know it's confusing and it's weird, so it's kind of like a watercolor, but not completely. It's kind of like an acrylic, but not completely. It's somewhere in the middle. Crazy. I don't know. I recommend you definitely try it out. Again, the paints are really cheap. You can probably get that whole set that you saw that I got. You know, I got that for like $6. So, you know, I highly recommend you try it. Again, it's a way cheaper medium to use than, you know, acrylic or watercolor. Maybe that's the benefit for it. You get both in one. So I recommend you go try it out and just explore. You know, if you're prone to more like liking watercolor or prone more to liking acrylic, I would suggest, you know, trying it, using it that way first. If you like acrylic, try using it like acrylic. If you like watercolor, try using it like watercolor. But there you go. That's how you use gouache. Whoosh. But yeah, go try it out for yourself, and yeah, go create something. Whoosh. It's Gouache.